Welcome. You've come to discover how Rome rose from its ashes, designed to gently guide you into profound, peaceful sleep. You'll be immersed in the extraordinary recovery and resurgence of the Roman Republic, narrated to bring you ultimate relaxation. Let's begin now with Book 6 of Titus Livius. After the city was thus restored, imagine a civilization shattered by invasion, only to rebuild itself stronger, not just physically, but politically. How did Rome, after the devastating Gaulish sack, manage to not only reconstruct its buildings, but also radically reform its government, expanding rights to its common citizens? And how can the echoes of this ancient renewal now bring stillness to your modern mind? This isn't just history. It's a testament to unwavering spirit and ingenious adaptation, perfectly presented to help you unwind and achieve deep sleep. Prepare to discover how Rome's inspiring comeback can surprisingly be your new favorite path to rest. If you find this journey peaceful, please like this video, share your thoughts on Rome's resilience in the comments below, and subscribe for more calming historical explorations. The History of Rome, Book 6. Chapter 1. The Foundations of Rome and Early Challenges. The transactions of the Romans, from the building of the city to its capture, I have exhibited in 5 books. This period, first under kings, then consuls, dictators, decemvirs, and consular tribunes, involved wars abroad and dissensions at home. These matters are obscure due to their great antiquity, like distant objects scarcely perceptible. Also in those times, the use of written records, the only faithful guardian of memory, was rare. Moreover, much of what was contained in the commentaries of the pontiffs and other public and private records was lost in the city's burning. Henceforth, from the city's second origin, which sprung up again more healthfully and vigorously, its achievements at home and abroad shall be narrated with greater clarity and authenticity. Rome now stood erect, leaning chiefly on Marcus Furius, the same support by which it had first been raised. They did not allow him to lay down the dictatorship until the end of the year. The tribunes, during whose office the city had been taken, were not permitted to preside at the elections for the following year. The administration then entered an interregnum. While the state was preoccupied with the constant labor of repairing the city, Gaius Marcius, tribune of the people, named a day of trial for Quintus Fabius. As soon as Fabius left office, he was charged because, as an ambassador, he had, contrary to the law of nations, appeared in arms against the Gauls, to whom he had been sent as a negotiator. Death removed him from this trial so opportunely that most people believed it voluntary. The interregnum began with Publius Cornelius Scipio as interrex, followed by Marcus Furius Camillus. Camillus nominated Lucius Valerius Publicola for a second time, Lucius Virginius, Publius Cornelius, Aulus Manlius, Lucius Aemilius, and Lucius Postumius as military tribunes with consular power. These tribunes, upon entering office immediately after the interregnum, consulted the Senate first on matters of religion. They ordered that all treaties and laws that could be found be collected. These included the 12 tables and some laws made under the kings. Some were publicly proclaimed, but those pertaining to religious matters were kept secret, mainly by the pontiffs, to maintain their hold over the people. Next, they turned their attention to desecrated days. The day before the 15th day of the calendars of August was marked by a double disaster. The Fabii were slain at Cremera, and later, the disgraceful battle that ruined the city was fought at Allia. They called this the Allian Day, after the latter disaster, and declared it unsuitable for any public or private business. Some believe that because Sulpicius, the military tribune, had not properly offered sacrifice on the day after the Ides of July, and because, without the gods' favor, the Roman army had been exposed to the enemy on the 3rd day after, an order was also made to abstain from all religious undertakings on the day following the Ides. Hence, the same religious observance was applied to the days following the calendars and the nones. However, they were not long allowed to consult quietly regarding the means of raising the city after such a grievous fall. On one side, their old enemies, the Volscians, had taken up arms to extinguish the Roman name. On the other hand, traders brought intelligence of a conspiracy among the leading men of Etruria from all its states, formed at the temple of Voltumna. A new cause of terror was added by the defection of the Latins and Hernicians, who, since the battle at Lake Regillus, had remained in unquestionable friendship with the Roman people. With such great alarms surrounding them on every side, it became apparent that the Roman name suffered not only hatred from its enemies, but also contempt from its allies. It was resolved that the state should be defended under the same auspices as those under which it had been recovered, and that Marcus Furius should be nominated dictator. As dictator, Camillus nominated Gaius Servilius Ahala as master of the horse. A suspension of all public business was proclaimed, and he held a levy of the juniors, dividing them into centuries after they had sworn allegiance to him. The army, once raised and equipped, was divided into 3 parts. One part was sent against Etruria in the Veientian territory, commanded by Lucius Aemilius. Another, commanded by military tribune Aulus Manlius, was ordered to pitch camp before the city. The third part Camillus led in person against the Volscians. Not far from Lanuvium, at a place called Ad Maculum, he began to storm their camp. The Volscians, who had set out to war out of contempt, believing that all Roman youth had been cut off by the Gauls, were struck with terror upon hearing that Camillus was appointed to command. They fortified themselves with a rampart, and the rampart itself with piled-up trees, to prevent the enemy from reaching their works. Observing this, Camillus ordered fire to be thrown into the fence facing him. A very strong wind happened to turn towards the enemy, not only opening a passage through the fire, but also directing the flames against the camp. The vapor, smoke, and crackling of the burning green timber so confounded the enemy that the Romans found less difficulty in passing the rampart into the Volscian camp than they had experienced in climbing over the fire-consumed fence. The enemy was routed and cut down. After the dictator took the camp by assault, he gave the booty to the soldiers, which was all the more agreeable as it was less expected from a commander not known for lavish generosity. Pursuing them in their flight, and having depopulated the entire Volscian land, Camillus at length forced the Volscians to surrender in their 70th year. After his victory, he moved from the Volscians to the Aequians, who were also preparing for hostilities. He surprised their army at Boli, and, attacking not only their camp but their city, took them at the first onset. While such fortune manifested itself where Camillus, the life and soul of Roman interests, was present, a great alarm had fallen on another quarter. Almost all Etruria, taking up arms, was besieging Sutrium, allies of the Roman people. Their ambassadors applied to the Senate, imploring aid in their distress, and obtained a decree that the dictator should, at the earliest opportunity, bring aid to the Sutrians. However, the circumstances of the besieged would not allow them to break the delay of this hope. The small number of townsmen were exhausted by labor, watching, and wounds, all falling heavily on the same individuals. The city was delivered to the enemy by capitulation, and its inhabitants were leaving their homes in a miserable train, discharged without arms and with only a single garment. At that juncture, Camillus happened to arrive at the head of the Roman army. When the mournful crowd prostrated themselves at his feet, and the address of the leading men, wrung from them by extreme necessity, was followed by the weeping of women and boys dragged along by their companions in exile, Camillus bade the Sutrians cease their lamentations, declaring that he brought grief and tears to the Etrurians. He then ordered the baggage to be deposited, and the Sutrians to remain there with a small guard, while the soldiers followed him in arms. Proceeding to Sutrium with his unencumbered army, he found, as he expected, everything in disorder, as usually happens in success. There was no advance guard before the walls, the gates lay open, and the conquerors were dispersed, carrying out booty from the enemy's houses. Sutrium was therefore taken a second time on the same day. The Etrurians, lately victorious, were cut down everywhere by their new enemy. No time was afforded to them to collect and form one body, or even to take up arms. When each pushed eagerly towards the gates, hoping to throw themselves into the fields, they found the gates shut, for the dictator had given those orders initially. Upon this, some took up arms, Others, who happened to be armed before the tumult overtook them, called their friends together to make battle. This would have been kindled by the despair of the enemy had not criers, sent in every direction through the city, issued orders that arms should be laid down, that the unarmed should be spared, and that no one should be injured except those who were armed. Then even those whose minds, in their last hope, had been obstinately bent on fighting, threw down their arms everywhere when hopes of life were offered, surrendering themselves unarmed to the enemy, which fortune had rendered the safer method. Their numbers being considerable, they were distributed among several guards. The town was, before night, restored to the Sutrians, uninjured and free from all the calamities of war, because it had not been taken by force but delivered up on terms. Camillus returned to the city in triumph, victorious in 3 wars simultaneously. By far the greatest number of prisoners led before his chariot were from among the Etrurians. These were sold by auction, raising such a sum of money that, after paying the matrons the price of their gold, 3 golden bowls were made from the surplus. These bowls, inscribed with the name of Camillus, certainly lay in the recess of Jupiter's temple, at the feet of Juno, before the burning of the Capitol. In that year, such of the Veientians, Capanatians, and Felicians who had come over to the Romans during the wars with those nations were admitted into the state, and land was assigned to these new citizens. Those also were recalled by a decree of the Senate from Veii, who, from a dislike of building at Rome, had gone to Veii and seized on the vacant houses there. At first, there was murmuring on their part, disregarding the order. Then, a day having been appointed, and capital punishment denounced against anyone who did not return to Rome, their collective refractory nature rendered them obedient when taken singly, each through fear for himself. Rome both increased in numbers and rose throughout its entire extent by its buildings. The state assisted with expenses, the aediles urged on the work as if public, and private persons, for the want of accommodation stimulated them, hastened to complete the work. Within a year, a new city was erected. Chapter 2. Political Tensions and Foreign Wars. At the termination of the year, an election was held for military tribunes with consular power. Those elected were Titus Quinctius Cincinnatus, Quintus Servilius Fidenas a 5th time, Lucius Julius Iulus, Lucius Aquilius Corvus, Lucius Lucretius Tricipidanus, and Servius Sulpicius Rufus. They led one army against the Equins, not to war, for the Equins owned themselves conquered, but out of animosity, to lay waste their territories lest they retain any strength for new designs. The other army went into the territory of Tarquinii. Here, Cortuosa and Contenebra, towns belonging to the Etrurians, were taken by storm and demolished. At Cortuosa, there was no contest. Having attacked it by surprise, they took it at the first shout and onset. The town was plundered and burned. Contenebra sustained a siege for a few days. It was continual labor, abetted neither by night nor by day, that reduced them. The Roman army, divided into 6 parts, with each division relieving the other in battle 1 hour in 6 in rotation, wore down the townsmen, who, few in number, were exposed to an ever-new contest. They at length yielded, and an opportunity was afforded to the Romans of entering the city. It was the wish of the tribunes that the spoil should be made public property, but the order was too late for their determination. While they hesitated, the spoil already became the property of the soldiers, nor could it be taken from them except by means likely to excite dissatisfaction. In the same year, to ensure that the city did not increase by private buildings only, the lower parts of the Capitol were also built of hewn stone, a work deserving of admiration even amid the present magnificence of the city. While the state was busily occupied in building, the tribunes of the commons sought to rally support for agrarian laws. The Pomptine territory, for the first time since the Volscians' power had been reduced by Camillus, was presented to them as their undisputed right. They charged that this district was more harassed by the nobility than it had been by the Volscians. Incursions by the Volscians lasted only as long as they had strength in arms, but the nobility encroached on public land. There would be no room for the commons, they argued, unless a division was made before all was seized. These arguments did not deeply impress the commons. They attended the forum in small numbers, due to their anxiety about building and the expenses incurred. Thus, they were less concerned about land for which they lacked the means to improve. The state was full of religious impressions, and even the leading men had become superstitious due to recent misfortunes. To renew the auspices, the government once more resorted to an interregnum. The successive interregents were Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, Servius Sulpicius Camerinus, and Lucius Valerius Potitus. The last of these finally held an election for military tribunes with consular power. He nominated Lucius Papirius, Gaius Cornelius, Gaius Sergius, Lucius Aemilius for a second time, Lucius Maninius, and Lucius Valerius Publicola for a third time. These men entered office after the interregnum. This year, the Temple of Mars, vowed during the Gallic War, was dedicated by Titus Quinctius, duumvir for religious rites. 4 tribes were added from the new citizens, the Stelatine, Tormentine, Sabbatine, and Arnian, bringing the total to 25 tribes. Regarding the Pomptine land, the matter was pressed by Lucius Sicinius, plebeian tribune, to the people, who now attended in greater numbers and were more readily aroused to desire land. Mention of war against the Latins and Hernicians was introduced in the Senate, but the matter was deferred due to a more important war, as Etruria was up in arms. Matters reverted to electing Camillus as military tribune with consular power. 5 colleagues were added: Servius Cornelius Melogenensis, Quintus Servilius Fidinas for a 6th time, Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, Lucius Horatius Pulvillus, and Publius Valerius. Chapter 3. The growing influence of Camillus and Tusculan peace. At the beginning of the year, the people's attention was diverted from the Etrurian War. A body of fugitives from the Pomptine district suddenly entered the city, bringing word that the Antians were up in arms. The states of the Latins privately sent their youth to this war, denying any public concert, and claiming that volunteers were simply not prevented from serving wherever they pleased. The Romans had now ceased to despise any wars. The Senate, therefore, gave thanks to the gods because Camillus was in office, knowing that it would have been necessary to nominate him dictator if he were in a private station. His colleagues agreed that when any terror of war threatened, the supreme direction of everything should be vested in one man, and they were determined to consign their authority to Camillus. They did not believe that any concession to his dignity would derogate from their own. After the tribunes were highly commended by the Senate, Camillus himself, covered with confusion, returned thanks. He then stated that a heavy burden was laid on him by the Roman people, by having now nominated him dictator for the 4th time, a great one by the Senate, due to such flattering judgments of that house concerning him, the greatest of all, however, by the condescension of such distinguished colleagues. If any addition could be made to his diligence and vigilance, he would, vying with himself, strive to render the state's unanimous opinion of him as permanent as it was honorable. Regarding the war against Antium, he stated there was more threat than danger, but advised that as they should fear nothing, so too should they despise nothing. The city of Rome was beset by the ill will and hatred of its neighbors. Therefore, the commonwealth should be maintained by a plurality of both generals and armies. "It is my wish," he said, "that you, Publius Valerius, as my associate in command and counsel, should lead the troops with me against the enemy at Antium. You, Quintus Servilius, after raising and equipping another army, shall encamp in the city, ready to act, whether Etruria, as lately, or these new causes of anxiety, the Latins and Hernicians, should bestir themselves. I deem it certain that you will conduct matters as is worthy of your father, grandfather, yourself, and 6 tribuneships. Let a 3rd army be raised by Lucius Quinctius, from those excused from service and the seniors, who may protect the city and its walls. Let Lucius Horatius provide arms, weapons, corn, and whatever other exigencies of war shall demand. You, Servius Cornelius, we, your colleagues, appoint the president of this council of the state, the guardian of religion, of the assemblies, of the laws, and of all matters pertaining to the city. All cheerfully promised their utmost endeavors in discharging their apportioned offices. Valerius, chosen as Camillus's associate in command, added that Marcus Furius should be considered by him as dictator, and that he would act as master of the horse to him. Therefore, they should entertain hopes regarding the war proportional to their opinion of their sole commander. The Senate, elated with joy, cried out that they entertained good hopes, both regarding war and peace and the Republic in general. The Republic would never have needed a dictator if it were to have such men in office, united in such harmony of sentiments, prepared alike to obey and to command, and who were laying up praise as common stock, rather than taking it from the common fund individually. A suspension of civil business was proclaimed, and a levy held. Furius and Valerius set out to Satricum, where the Antians had gathered not only the youth of the Volscians, selected from the new generation, but immense numbers of Latins and Hernicians from states whose long enjoyment of peace left them in an unimpaired condition. The new enemy, added to the old, shook the spirits of the Roman soldiers. When the centurions reported to Camillus, while he was forming his battle line, that the minds of the soldiers were disturbed, that arms were taken up by them with backwardness, and that they left the camp with hesitation and reluctance, nay, that some expressions were heard, that they should each have to fight with 100 enemies, and that such numbers, even if unarmed, much less when furnished with arms, could with difficulty be withstood, he leaped on his horse. In front of the troops, turning to the line and riding between the ranks, he called out, "What dejection of mind is this, soldiers, what backwardness? Is it with the enemy, or me, or yourselves you are unacquainted? What else is the enemy but the constant subject of your bravery and your glory? On the other hand, with me as your general, to say nothing of the taking of Falerii and Veii, you have lately celebrated a triple triumph for a threefold victory over these selfsame Volscians and Aequians and Etruria. Do you not recognize me as your general because I gave you the signal, not as dictator, but as tribune? I neither feel the want of the highest authority over you, and you should look to nothing in me but myself. For the dictatorship neither added to my courage, any more than exile took it from me. We are all therefore the same individuals, and as we bring to this war the same requisites as we brought to former wars, let us look for the same result of the war. As soon as you commence the fight, each will do that which he has learned and been accustomed to do. You will conquer, they will run." Then, giving the signal, he leaped from his horse and, seizing the standard-bearer next to him by the hand, hurried him against the enemy, calling aloud, "Soldiers, advance the standard." When they saw Camillus himself, though now disabled by age for bodily exertion, advancing against the enemy, they all rushed forward together, raising a shout, each eagerly crying out, "Follow the general!" They say further that the standard was thrown into the enemy's line by order of Camillus, and that the vanguard then exerted itself to recover it. There, the Antians were first forced to give way, and the panic spread, not only to the first line, but to the reserve troops also. This impression was made not merely by the ardor of the soldiers animated by their general's presence, but because nothing was more terrible to the Volscian minds than the sight of Camillus, which happened to present itself. Thus, wherever he went, he carried certain victory with him. This was particularly evident when, hastily mounting his horse, he rode with a footman's shield to the left wing, which was almost giving way. By showing himself, he restored the battle, pointing out the rest of the line gaining victory. The result was now decided, but the enemy's flight was impeded by their great numbers, and the weary soldiers would have had tedious work putting so many to the sword. Suddenly, rain falling with a violent storm put an end to the pursuit of the victory, which was now decided, rather than to the battle itself. Then, the signal for retreat being given, nightfall ended the war without further trouble to the Romans. The Latins and Hernicians, having abandoned the Volscians, marched to their homes, having achieved results corresponding to their wicked measures. The Volscians, seeing themselves deserted by those through reliance on whom they had resumed hostilities, abandoned their camp and shut themselves within the walls of Satricum. Camillus at first prepared to surround them with lines of circumvallation, and to prosecute the siege with a mound and other works. But seeing that this was obstructed by no sally from the town, and considering that the enemy possessed too little spirit for him to wait in tedious expectation of victory, He exhorted his soldiers not to exhaust themselves with tedious labors, as they had done when besieging VI. Declaring that victory was in their hands, he attacked the walls on every side amidst the great alacrity of the soldiers, and took the town by escalade. The Volscians, throwing down their arms, surrendered themselves. The enemy's army, relying solely on their numbers and judging both armies merely by sight, entered the battle rashly and surrendered just as rashly. Fierce only in their shouts and with their missiles at the first onset, they could not withstand the Roman swords, the close-quarters combat, and the fiery looks of their eager opponents. Their front line was driven back, confusion spread to the reserves, and the cavalry caused alarm. The ranks broke in many places, everything was in motion, and the line seemed to fluctuate. When the foremost fell, and each man saw death approaching, they turned their backs. The Romans pursued them closely. As long as the enemy retreated armed and in formation, the infantry bore the burden of the pursuit. But when their arms were thrown away in every direction, and the enemy's line scattered across the countryside, squadrons of horse were sent out. They were instructed not to waste time massacring individuals, thereby allowing the multitude to escape. It would suffice to impede their speed with missiles and terror, and to delay their progress with skirmishing until the infantry could overtake and dispatch the enemy with regular slaughter. There was no end to the flight and slaughter before nightfall. On the same day, the Volscian camp was also taken and pillaged, and all plunder, except persons of free condition, was given to the soldiers. The greatest part of the prisoners consisted of Latins and Hernicians, and not merely plebeian rank, suggesting they served for hire, but some young men of rank were found among them. This was evident proof that the Volscian enemies had been aided by public authority. Some Circeans were also recognized, and colonists from Velletri. All were sent to Rome and, when interrogated by leading senators, plainly revealed the defection of their respective states, just as they had done to the dictator. The dictator kept his army in the standing camp, not doubting that the Senate would order war with these states. However, a more momentous difficulty at home made it necessary for him to be sent for to Rome. The sedition, gaining strength daily, was becoming more formidable due to its fomenter. It was now easy to see the motives behind Manlius's discourses and actions, which, though seemingly prompted by popular zeal, simultaneously tended to create disturbance. When he saw a centurion, distinguished for his military exploits, being led to prison due to a judgment for debt, Manlius ran up with his attendants in the middle of the forum and laid hands on him. Exclaiming aloud against the insolence of the patricians, the cruelty of the usurers, and the grievances of the commons, and the man's merits and misfortunes, he declared, "Then indeed, in vain have I preserved the capital and citadel by this right hand, if I am to see my fellow citizen and fellow soldier, as if captured by the victorious Gauls, dragged into slavery and chains." He then openly paid the debt to the creditor before the people, and having purchased his freedom with the scales and brass, he set the man at liberty. The man implored both gods and men to grant recompense to Marcus Manlius, his liberator, the parent of the Roman commons. Immediately received into the tumultuous crowd, he himself increased the tumult, displaying the scars received in the Veientian, Gallic, and other succeeding wars. He claimed that while serving in the field and rebuilding his demolished dwelling, though he had paid off the principal many times over, the interest always kept down the principal, and he had been overwhelmed with interest. Through Marcus Manlius's kind interference, he now beheld the light, the forum, and the faces of his fellow citizens. He received from Manlius all the kind services usually conferred by parents. Therefore, he devoted whatever remained of his person, life, and blood to him. Whatever ties subsisted between him and his country, public and private guardian deities, were all centered in that one man. When the commons, moved by these expressions, were now wholly in the interest of this one individual, another circumstance was added, emanating from a scheme even more calculated to create general confusion. Manlius subjected a farm in the Veientian territory, the principal part of his estate, to public sale, stating, "That I may not suffer any of you Romans, as long as any of my property shall remain, to be dragged off to prison after judgment has been given against him, and he has been consigned to a creditor. This circumstance so inflamed their minds that they seemed determined to follow the asserto of their freedom through everything, right and wrong. Besides this, speeches were made at his house, as if he were delivering a public harangue, full of imputations against the patricians. Among these he threw out, without distinction of truth or falsehood, that treasures of Gallic gold were concealed by the patricians. He claimed they were no longer content with possessing public lands unless they also appropriated public money. If that were made public, the commons might be freed from their debt. When this hope was presented, it seemed a scandalous proceeding that when gold was to be contributed to ransom the state from the Gauls, the collection was made by a public tribute. Yet the same gold, when taken from the Gauls, had become the plunder of a few. Accordingly, they pursued the inquiry as to where such an enormous treasure could be kept. When he deferred, and told them that he would inform them at the proper time, all other objects were abandoned, and the attention of all was directed to this point. It became evident that neither their gratitude, if the information were true, nor their displeasure if it proved false, would know any bounds. In this state of affairs, the dictator, being summoned home from the army, came into the city. A meeting of the Senate was held the following day. Having sufficiently sounded the inclinations of the people, he forbade the Senate to leave him. Attended by that body, he placed his throne in the Comitium and sent his sergeant to Marcus Manlius. Manlius, on being summoned by the dictator's order, after he had intimated to his party that a contest was at hand, came to the tribunal, attended by a numerous party. On one side stood the Senate, on the other the people, as if in battle array, each party attentively observing their respective leader. Then, silence being made, the dictator said, "I wish that I and the Roman patricians may agree with the commons on all other matters, as I am confident we shall agree on the business which regards you, and on that about which I am about to interrogate you. I perceive that hopes have been raised by you in the minds of the citizens that, with safety to the public credit, their debts may be paid off out of the Gallic treasures, which it is alleged the leading patricians are secreting. To which proceeding, so far am I from being any obstruction, that on the contrary, Marcus Manlius, I exhort you to free the Roman commons from the weight of interest, and to tumble from their secreted spoil those who lie now brooding on those public treasures. If you refuse to do this, whether because you yourself desire to be a sharer in the spoil, or because the information is unfounded, I shall order you to be carried off to prison, nor will I any longer suffer the multitude to be disquieted by you with delusive hopes." To this Manlius replied, it had not escaped him that it was not against the Volscians, who were enemies as often as it suited the interests of the patricians, nor against the Latins and Hernicians, whom they were driving into hostilities by false charges, but against him and the Roman commons, that he was appointed dictator. Now the war being dropped, which was only feigned, an attack was being made against himself. The dictator now professed to defend the usurers against the commons. A charge and destruction was sought for him out of the favor of the multitude. "Does the crowd that surrounds my person offend you?" said he. "Aulus Cornelius, and you conscript fathers? Why then do you not draw it away from me, each of you by your own acts of kindness? By becoming surety, by delivering your fellow citizens from the stocks, by preventing those cast in lawsuits and assigned over to their creditors from being dragged away to prison, by sustaining the necessities of others out of your own superfluities? But why do I exhort you to expend out of your own property? Fix some capital, deduct from the principal what has been paid in interest. Soon will my crowd not be a whit more remarkable than that of any other person. But I may be asked, why do I alone thus interest myself on behalf of my fellow citizens? I have no other answer to give than if you were to ask me, why in the same way did I alone preserve the capital and the citadel? Both then I afforded the aid which I could to all collectively, and now I will afford it to each individually. Now with respect to the Gallic treasures, the mode of interrogation renders difficult a matter which in itself is easy. For why do you ask that which you know? Why do you order that which is in your own laps to be shaken out of them rather than resign it, unless some fraud lurks beneath? The more you require your own impositions to be examined into, the more do I dread lest you should blind the eyes of those narrowly watching you. Therefore, it is not I that am to be compelled to discover your hoard, but you must be forced to produce it to the public." When the dictator ordered him to set aside evasion and urged him to prove the truth of his information, or to own the guilt of having advanced a false accusation against the Senate and of having exposed them to the odium of a lying charge of concealment, Manlius refused to speak, to meet the wishes of his enemies. The dictator then ordered him to be carried off to prison. When arrested by the sergeant, he exclaimed, "O Jupiter, supremely great and good, imperial Juno, and Minerva, and ye other gods and goddesses, who inhabit the capital and citadel, do ye suffer your soldier and defender to be thus harassed by his enemies? Shall this right hand, by which I beat off the Gauls from your temples, be now in bonds and chains?" Neither the eyes nor ears of anyone could well endure the indignity thus offered him, but the state, most patient of legitimate authority, had rendered certain offices absolute to themselves. Neither the tribunes of the commons nor the commons themselves dared to raise their eyes or utter a sentence in opposition to the dictatorial power. On Manlius being thrown into prison, it appears that a great part of the commons put on mourning, that a great many persons had let their hair and beard grow, and that a dejected crowd presented itself at the entrance of the prison. The dictator triumphed over the Volscians, but that triumph was an occasion of ill will rather than glory. For they murmured that it had been acquired at home, not abroad, and that it was celebrated over a citizen, not over an enemy, that only one thing was wanting to his arrogance, that Manlius was not led before his car. And now the affair fell little short of sedition. To appease this, the Senate, without solicitation, suddenly becoming bountiful of their own free will, decreed that a colony of 2,000 Roman citizens should be conducted to Satricum. 2.5 acres of land were assigned to each. When they considered this, both as scanty in itself, conferred on a few, and as a bribe for betraying Marcus Manlius, the sedition was irritated by the remedy. Now the crowd of Manlius's partisans became more remarkable, both by their squalid attire and by the appearance of persons under prosecutions, and terror being removed by the resignation of the dictatorship, after the triumph had set both the tongues and thoughts of men at liberty. Expressions of anger filled the air as people upbraided the multitude, accusing them of repeatedly abandoning their champions. "By your favor," they cried, "you always raise your defenders to a precipice, then forsake them at the critical moment of danger." They recalled Spurius Cassius, undone for inviting the common people to share in the lands. They remembered Spurius Maelius, destroyed after warding off famine from his fellow citizens at his own expense. And now, Marcus Manlius, betrayed to his enemies while striving to free half the state from the burden of usury. The common people, they lamented, fatten their favorites only for slaughter. Is this the punishment, they demanded, if a man of consular rank does not bow to a dictator? Suppose he lied once, and for that reason had no answer to give. What slave is ever imprisoned merely for a lie? Have you forgotten that night, they continued, the night that nearly brought an eternal end to the Roman name? Do you not recall the band of Gauls scaling the Tarpeian rock? Do you not remember Marcus Manlius himself, as you saw him then, in arms, covered with sweat and blood, having, in a way, rescued Jupiter himself from the enemy's grasp? Was a mere pittance of corn the recompense for the preserver of your country? And now, will you allow a man whom you almost deified, whom you placed on equal footing with Jupiter, at least with the surname Capitolinus, to languish in a dark prison, awaiting an executioner's will? Is there sufficient aid in one person for all, yet no relief for one man from so many? The crowd refused to disperse, even through the night, threatening to break open the prison. Ultimately, the Senate, conceding what the people were about to take by force, decreed Manlius's release. However, this act did not end the sedition. It merely provided the uprising with a leader. Around the same time, the Latins and Hernicians, along with the colonists of Circeii and Velletri, sought to clear themselves of involvement in the Volscian War. They demanded the return of their prisoners, intending to punish them under their own laws. They received a harsh reply. The colonists, being Roman citizens, were rebuked even more severely for their abominable design to attack their own country. Not only were their requests for prisoners denied, but the Senate, though refraining from such a measure with the allies, ordered them to immediately depart from the city, from the presence and sight of the Roman people. The law of the embassy, they were reminded, protected foreigners, not citizens. With the year's end, the sedition stirred by Manlius reasserted its former violence. Elections were held, and military tribunes with consular power were chosen from the patricians: Servius Cornelius Melugинensis for a third time, Publius Valerius Potitus for a second, Marcus Furius Camillus, Servius Sulpicius Rufus for a second, Caius Papirius Crassus, and Titus Quinctius Cincinnatus for a second time. At the beginning of this new year, peace with foreign nations offered opportunities to both patricians and plebeians. The plebeians, unburdened by military levies, hoped to abolish usury with such an influential leader. The patricians, free from external threats, could focus on resolving domestic issues. Thus, both sides prepared for the coming conflict with renewed vigor. Manlius, too, was ready. He summoned the common people to his home, holding consultations day and night with their leaders to plan a revolution. He was now filled with even greater spirit and resentment than before. The recent ignominy had ignited fury in a mind and used to affront. He was further emboldened because the dictator had not dared to act against him with the same severity that Quinctius Cincinnatus had shown toward Spurius Maelius. Moreover, the dictator had not only abdicated his office to avoid the unpopularity of Manlius's imprisonment, but even the Senate itself could not withstand the public outcry. Elated and exasperated, Manlius began to inflame the already heated minds of the common people. "How long," he asked, "will you remain ignorant of your own strength, a strength nature has not even denied to beasts? Count your numbers and your enemies. Even if each of you faced a single opponent, I believe you would strive more vigorously for liberty than they would for tyranny. For as many of you as gathered around each patron, so many will be against a single enemy. Only make a show of war, and you shall have peace. Let them see you prepared for open force. They themselves will relax their pretensions. Collectively you must attempt something, or individually submit to everything. How long will you look at me? I, for my part, will not abandon any of you. See that my fortune does not fail. I, your avenger, when my enemies deemed it fit, was suddenly reduced to nothing. All of you witnessed the man who shielded each of you from chains, thrown into chains himself. What am I to hope for if my enemies attempt more against me? Am I to expect the fate of Cassius and Maelius? You acted kindly in appearing shocked. The gods will avert it, but they will never descend from heaven for my sake. They must inspire you with the determination to avert it, just as they inspired me, in arms and in peace, to defend you from barbarous foes and tyrannical fellow citizens. Is the spirit of such a great people so base that mere aid against your adversaries always satisfies you? Are you to know no contest against the patricians, except how you may suffer them to dominate you? This is not implanted in you by nature, but you are theirs by possession. Why do you bear such a spirit with foreigners, believing it right that you should rule over them? Because you have been accustomed to contend with them for empire, while against these you merely attempt liberty rather than truly maintain it. Nevertheless, whatever sort of leaders you have had, whatever your own conduct, you have, until now, gained everything you demanded, either by force or by your own good fortune. It is now time to aim at still higher objects. Only test your own good fortune in me, who, I hope, has already proven beneficial to you. You will with less difficulty establish someone to rule the patricians than you have established persons to resist their rule. Dictatorships and consulships must be leveled to the ground, so that the Roman commons may be able to raise their heads. Therefore, stand by me, prevent judicial proceedings regarding money. I profess myself the patron of the commons, a title with which my solicitude and zeal invests me. If you will dignify your leader with any more distinguishing title of honor or command, you will render him still more powerful to obtain what you desire. From this speech, his first attempt to gain regal power is said to have arisen. However, no clear account survives regarding his co-conspirators or the full extent of his designs. Meanwhile, the Senate deliberated on the secession of the common people to a private house, one, as it happened, situated in the citadel. They recognized the great danger threatening liberty. Many cried out for a Servilius Ahala, a man who would not provoke a public enemy by ordering his imprisonment, but rather end an internal conflict with the loss of a single citizen. They passed a resolution milder in terms, but possessing the same force, that the magistrates should ensure the commonwealth received no detriment from the designs of Marcus Manlius. The consular tribunes and the tribunes of the commons, who had submitted to the Senate's authority, seeing that the end of their own power and the liberty of all would be the same, consulted on what must be done. When nothing suggested itself but violence and bloodshed, and it became clear that such a course would be greatly perilous, Marcus Manlius and Quintus Publilius, tribunes of the commons, spoke. Why do we make this a contest between the patricians and the commons, which ought to be between the state and one destructive citizen? Why do we attack, alongside the commons, a man whom it is safer to attack through the commons themselves, so that he may fall overpowered by his own strength? We intend to appoint a day of trial for him. Nothing is less popular than regal power. As soon as the multitude perceives that the contest is not with them, and that from advocates they are to become judges, and shall behold the prosecutors from among the commons, the accused a patrician, and the charge between both parties being that of aiming at regal power, they will favor nothing more than their own liberty. With the approval of all, they appointed a day of trial for Manlius. When this occurred, the common people were initially stirred, especially seeing the accused in mourning attire, and with him not only none of the patricians, but not even any of his kinsmen or relatives, nor even his brothers Aulus and Titus Manlius. This was an unprecedented circumstance, that at such a critical juncture, a man's closest friends did not put on mourning. They remarked that when Appius Claudius was imprisoned, Caius Claudius, who was an enemy to him and the entire Claudian family, appeared in mourning. They feared that this favorite of the people was about to be destroyed by a conspiracy, simply because he was the first patrician to align with the commons. When the appointed day arrived, I found no author detailing the specific acts alleged by the prosecutors that directly proved the charge of aspiring to kingly power, beyond his assembling the multitude, his seditious expressions, his generous gifts, and his pretended discovery. I have no doubt, however, that these were far from unimportant, as the people's delay in condemning him was caused not by the merits of the case, but by the chosen location of the trial. This seems noteworthy, so that people may understand how Manlius's depraved ambition for regal power rendered his great and glorious achievements not only devoid of all merit, but utterly hateful. He is said to have brought forward nearly 400 people to whom he had lent money without interest, whose goods he had prevented from being sold, and whom he had saved from imprisonment at the hands of their creditors. Beyond this, he not only recounted his military rewards, but also displayed them: spoils from 30 slain enemies, 40 presents from generals, among which were 2 mural crowns and 8 civic crowns. Furthermore, he presented citizens he had saved from the enemy, including Caius Servilius, then master of the horse, though absent on this occasion. After recounting his wartime exploits in pompous language befitting the dignity of the subject, matching his deeds with his eloquence, he bared his breast, marked with scars received in battle. Again and again, he directed his gaze to the Capitol, calling upon Jupiter and the other gods to aid him in his present plight. He prayed that the same sentiments with which they had inspired him when protecting the fortress of the Capitol for the preservation of the Roman people would now inspire the Roman people within his critical situation. He implored them, individually and collectively, to form their judgment of him with their eyes fixed on the Capitol and citadel, and their faces turned toward the immortal gods. As the people were summoned by sentries in the field of Mars, and as the accused, extending his hands toward the Capitol, directed his prayers from men to the gods, it became evident to the tribunes that unless they removed the people's gaze from the memory of such a great exploit, even the most well-founded charge would find no traction in minds prejudiced by his services. Thus, the day of trial was adjourned. A meeting of the people was then summoned in the Poetline Grove, outside the Nomentan gate, from where there was no view of the capital. There the charge was successfully presented, and with their minds now unmoved by extraneous circumstances, a fatal sentence, one that horrified even his judges, was passed upon him. Some state that he was condemned by duumvirs appointed to inquire into cases of treason. The tribunes cast him down from the Tarpeian rock. The same place became, for one man, a monument of distinguished glory and of extreme punishment. Marks of infamy were offered to him even in death. One, a public one, was that his house, where the temple of Moneta and the mint office now stand, be razed, and it was proposed to the people that no patrician should ever again dwell in the citadel and capital. The other infamy pertained to his family. It was decreed that no one of the Manlian family should ever thereafter bear the name Marcus Manlius. Such was the fate of a man who, had he not been born in a free state, would have been celebrated by posterity. In a short time, when there was no longer any danger from him, the people, remembering only his virtues, were seized with regret for him. A pestilence, which soon followed, with no apparent causes for such a great calamity, seemed to many to have arisen from the punishment inflicted on Manlius. The capital, they said, had been polluted with the blood of its preserver, nor was it agreeable to the gods that the punishment of him by whom their temples had been rescued from the hands of the enemy had been brought, in a manner, before their very eyes. The pestilence was followed by a scarcity of crops. The news of both calamities spread, leading to a series of wars in the following year. Lucius Valerius, for the 4th time, Aulus Manlius, for the 3rd, Servius Sulpicius, for the 3rd, Lucius Lucretius, Lucius Aemilius, for the 3rd, and Marcus Trebonius served as military tribunes with consular power. Besides the Volscians, destined by some fate to perpetually engage Roman soldiers, and the colonies of Circeii and Velletri, long contemplating revolt, along with the suspected region of Latium, new enemies suddenly emerged from Lanuvium, once a most loyal city. The senators, believing this stemmed from contempt due to the prolonged impunity of their own citizens in Velletri, decreed that a proposition for war against them should be submitted to the people at the earliest opportunity. To further sway the common people, they appointed 5 commissioners to distribute the Pomptine land and 3 to establish a colony in Nepete. Then, the proposal for war was put to the people. Despite the futile efforts of the plebeian tribunes to dissuade them, all the tribes voted for war. That year, preparations were made, but the army was not deployed due to the continuing pestilence. This delay gave the colonists ample time to appease the Senate's anger. Many among them were inclined to send an embassy seeking peace with Rome. However, as often happens, private dangers intertwined with public concerns. Those who had instigated the revolt, fearing they alone would be held accountable and handed over as victims to Roman wrath, dissuaded the colonies from pursuing peace. Not only was the embassy blocked, but a significant portion of the common people were incited to conduct raids into Roman territory. This new injury shattered all hope of peace. That year, reports first surfaced regarding a revolt by the Praenestans. The people of Tusculum, Gabii, and Lavisae, whose territories had been raided, accused them directly. The Senate's reply was so conciliatory that it became evident they gave less credit to the accusations, simply because they wished them not to be true. In the following year, the new military tribunes, Spurius and Lucius Papirius, led the legions to Velletri. Their 4 colleagues, Servius Cornelius Meluginensis for the 4th time, Quintus Servilius, Servius Sulpicius, and Lucius Aemilius for the 4th time, remained to protect the city and to respond to any new unrest from Etruria, as trouble was anticipated from that quarter. At Velletri, the Romans fought a successful battle against the auxiliaries from Praeneste, whose numbers were almost greater than the colonists themselves. The city's proximity caused the enemy to flee sooner and served as their only refuge after their retreat. The tribunes refrained from besieging the town, both because the outcome was uncertain and because they believed the war should not aim for the complete destruction of the colony. Letters announcing the victory were sent to the Senate in Rome, expressing more animosity toward the Praenestan enemy than toward those of Velletri. Consequently, by a decree of the Senate and an order of the people, war was declared against the Praenestans. The following year, the Praenestans, in conjunction with the Volscians, stormed Satricum, a Roman colony, after an obstinate defense by its inhabitants. They then made a disgraceful use of their victory with regard to the prisoners. Incensed by this, the Romans elected Marcus Furius Camillus as military tribune for the 7th time. His colleagues were the two postumii regilenses, Aulus and Lucius, along with Lucius Furius, Lucius Lucretius, and Marcus Fabius Ambustus. The Volscian War was assigned to Marcus Furius out of the ordinary course, and Lucius Furius was chosen by lot from among the tribunes to assist him. This proved less advantageous to the public than it was a source of praise for Camillus, his colleague. On public grounds, Camillus restored the Roman position, which had been jeopardized by his colleague's rash conduct. On private grounds, from Lucius Furius's error, Camillus sought to earn his gratitude rather than his own glory. Camillus was now in the decline of life. At the election, he prepared to take the usual oath to excuse himself on the plea of his health, but the people universally opposed him. Yet his active mind remained vigorous within his ardent breast. He retained all his faculties. Although he now concerned himself little with civil affairs, war still roused him. He enlisted 4 legions, each consisting of 4,000 men, and ordered the troops to assemble the next day at the Esquiline Gate before setting out for Satricum. There the conquerors of the colony awaited him, undismayed and confident in their superior numbers. Upon perceiving the Roman approach, they immediately marched out to the field, determined to risk everything in an engagement without delay. They sought to prevent Camillus's renowned judgment, on which the Romans solely relied, from yielding any advantage. A similar ardor filled the Roman army. Only the wisdom and authority of one man delayed the fortune of the battle. Camillus sought, by prolonging the war, an opportunity to augment their strength with skill. The enemy, however, pressed them even harder. They not only drew up their troops in battle order before their camp, but advanced into the middle of the plain, digging trenches near the Roman battalions to display their insolent confidence. The Roman soldiers were indignant. Lucius Furius, the other military tribune, was even more so. Encouraged by his youth and natural disposition, he was further elated by the hopes of the multitude, who displayed great spirits on uncertain grounds. He instigated the already excited soldiers by disparaging his colleague's authority, using his age as the only point of attack. He constantly asserted that wars were the province of young men, and that with the body, the mind also flourishes and withers. From being a most vigorous warrior, Camillus had become a drone. The man who, upon arriving, was accustomed to capture camps and cities at the first onset, now consumed time inactive within the trenches. What increase in his own strength, or diminution of the enemy's, did he hope for? What opportunity, what season, what place for stratagem? The old man's plans were frigid and languid. Camillus had had a sufficient share of life and glory. What good was it to allow the strength of a state, which ought to be immortal, to decline into old age along with one mortal body? By such observations, he captured the attention of the entire camp. When battle was called for from every quarter, Lucius Furius declared, "Marcus Furius, we cannot withstand the soldiers' violence. The enemy, whose spirits we have increased by delaying, now insults us with unbearable insolence. You, one man, must yield to all and allow yourself to be overcome in council, so that you may be sooner overcome in battle." To this, Camillus replied that, whatever wars had been waged up to that day under his single auspices, neither he himself nor the Roman people had been dissatisfied with his judgment or his fortune. Now he knew he had a colleague, his equal in command and authority, and superior in the vigor of youth. Regarding the army, he had been accustomed to rule, not to be ruled. He could not interfere with his colleague's authority. Lucius Furius might do, with the favor of the gods, whatever he deemed to be in the state's interest. Camillus would even solicit for his years the indulgence that he might not be placed in the front line. Whatever duties in war an old man could discharge, in those he would not be deficient. He prayed to the immortal gods that no mischance might prove his plan to be the more advisable. Neither his sound advice was heeded by men, nor such pious prayers by the gods. The instigator of the battle drew up the front line. Camillus formed the reserve and posted a strong guard before the camp. He himself took his station on an elevated place, a spectator anxiously watching the outcome of the other's plan. As soon as the arms clashed at the first encounter, the enemy retreated, not from fear but from stratagem. There was a gentle slope behind them, between their army and their camp. Because they had sufficient numbers, they had left several strong cohorts, armed and ready for action, in the camp. These were to rush forth once the battle began and the enemy approached the rampart. The Romans, drawn onto disadvantageous ground by pursuing the retreating enemy in disorder, became exposed to this sally. Terror, therefore, turned on the victors. This new force, combined with the valley's slope, caused the Roman line to give way. The Volscians, attacking fresh from the camp, pressed them hard. Those who had feigned flight also rejoined the fight. The Roman soldiers no longer recovered. Unmindful of their recent presumption and former glory, they turned their backs in every direction, fleeing in disorderly haste toward their camp. At that moment, Camillus, mounted on his horse by those around him, swiftly brought up the reserve troops. "Is this," he cried, "soldiers, the battle you called for? What man, what god can you blame? That was your rashness, this is your cowardice. Having followed another leader, now follow Camillus. As you are accustomed to do under my leadership, conquer. Why do you look at the rampart and camp? That camp shall receive not a man of you, except as victor." Shame at first halted their disorderly flight. Then, when they saw the standards wheel about, a line formed to meet the enemy, and the general, distinguished by so many triumphs and venerable by age, presenting himself in front of the battalions where the greatest toil and danger lay, everyone began to upbraid both themselves and others. Mutual exhortation, with a brisk shout, pervaded the entire line. Nor was the other tribune absent from the occasion. Dispatched to the cavalry by his colleague, who was restoring the infantry line not by rebuking them, a task for which his share in their fault rendered him a weak authority, but by entirely turning from command to entreaties, he implored them, individually and collectively, to redeem him from blame, for he was answerable for the events of that day. Despite my colleague's reluctance and dissuasion, I made myself a partner in the rashness of all rather than in the prudence of one. Camillus sees his own glory in your fortune, whatever it may be. For my part, unless the battle is restored, I shall feel the result with you all, and endure the infamy alone, which is most distressing. It was deemed best that the cavalry should join the still unsteady infantry line, and attack the enemy by fighting on foot. Distinguished by their arms and courage, they advanced wherever they saw the infantry line most pressed. Neither among the officers nor the soldiers was there any abatement from the utmost effort of courage. The outcome, therefore, felt the aid of their exerted bravery. The Volscians were put to genuine flight in the direction from which they had lately retreated under pretended fear. Many were slain in the battle itself, and afterward in flight. The others were captured in the camp, which was taken in the same onset. More, however, were captured than slain. When an account of the prisoners was taken, several Tusculans were recognized. Separated from the rest, they were brought before the tribunes. Under interrogation, they confessed that they had taken up arms with the full authority of their state. Alarmed by the prospect of war so close to home, Camillus declared he would immediately transport the prisoners to Rome. He wanted the Senate to know, without delay, that the Tusculans had broken their alliance. Meanwhile, his colleague, if he saw fit, was to command the camp and army. The previous day's events had taught Lucius Furius not to prefer his own judgment over better counsel. Neither Lucius Furius nor anyone in the army believed that Camillus would overlook his colleague's misconduct, which had brought the Commonwealth into such perilous straits. Both in the army and at Rome, the consensus was clear. In the mixed fortunes against the Volscians, the blame for the unsuccessful battle and flight lay with Lucius Furius, while all the glory of the victory belonged to Camillus. With the prisoners brought before the Senate, a decree was passed to wage war against the Tusculans. The Senate entrusted the conduct of this war to Camillus, who then requested an assistant for the task. Allowed to choose any of his colleagues, Camillus, contrary to everyone's expectation, requested Lucius Furius. Through this moderation, he both alleviated his colleagues' disgrace and earned great glory for himself. Ultimately, there was no war with the Tusculans. They averted Roman aggression through a steadfast commitment to peace, something they could not have achieved through arms. When the Romans entered their territory, there were no evacuations from roadside areas, and the cultivation of the fields continued uninterrupted. The city gates lay open, and crowds of citizens, dressed in their civilian robes, came forth to meet the generals. Provisions for the army were brought with alacrity from the city and the surrounding lands. Camillus pitched his camp before the gates. Wishing to ascertain whether the same peaceful appearance displayed in the countryside also prevailed within the walls, he entered the city. He found the gates open, goods openly for sale in the shops, workmen engaged in their various tasks, and the schools bustling with the voices of scholars. The streets were filled with people of all kinds, with boys and women going about their daily business. Nowhere was there any sign of panic or even surprise. He observed every detail, carefully searching for any indication of war. No trace suggested anything had been removed or prepared for conflict. Everything was in such a state of steady, tranquil peace that it scarcely seemed the rumor of war could have reached them. Overcome by the enemy's submissive demeanor, Camillus ordered their senate to be convened. "Tusculans," he declared, "you are the only people who have yet discovered the true arms and the true strength by which to protect your possessions from Roman resentment. Proceed to Rome and address the Senate. The fathers will consider whether you have deserved more punishment for your past conduct or forgiveness for your present actions. I shall not anticipate your gratitude for a favor to be conferred by the state. From me, you shall have the power to seek pardon. The Senate will grant to your entreaties such a result as they deem fitting." When the Tusculans arrived in Rome, the sight of the Senate of a people who, until recently, had been faithful allies, now standing with sorrowful countenances in the porch of the Senate house, immediately moved the senators. They ordered them to be called in a friendly rather than hostile manner. The Tusculan dictator spoke as follows: "Conscript fathers, we against whom you proclaimed and waged war, just as you see us now standing in the porch of your house, so armed and so attired did we go forth to meet your generals and your legions. This was our custom, this the custom of our common people, and ever shall be, unless we receive arms and defense from you. We thank your generals and your troops for having trusted their eyes more than their ears, and for having committed no hostile acts where none were present. The peace which we observed, the same we solicit at your hands. We pray you, turn war toward the quarter where, if anywhere, it truly resides. What your arms may affect us, if after our submission we are to experience it, we will experience unarmed. This is our determination. May the immortal gods grant that it be as successful as it is dutiful. With respect to the charges by which you were induced to declare war against us, though it is needless to refute by words what has been contradicted by facts, yet, even admitting they were true, we believe it safe for us to confess them, after having shown such evident marks of repentance. Admit then that we have offended you, since you deserve that such satisfaction be made to you." These were nearly the words used by the Tusculans. They obtained peace at the present, and not long after, the freedom of the state as well. The legions were withdrawn from Tusculum. Chapter 4. Renewed disputes and dictatorial intervention. Camillus, distinguished by his prudence and bravery in the Volscian War, by his success in the Tusculan expedition, and in both by his extraordinary moderation and forbearance toward his colleague, now left office. The military tribunes for the following year were Lucius Valerius, for the 5th time, Publius Valerius, for the 3rd time, Caius Sergius, for the 3rd time, Lucius Menenius, for the 2nd time, Spurius Papirius, and Servius Cornelius Melugинensis. The year also required censors, chiefly due to the uncertain representations regarding debt. The tribunes of the commons exaggerated the amount of debt to stir public resentment, while those whose interest it was to make payment difficulties appear to stem from a lack of integrity rather than ability in debtors understated it. Caius Sulpicius Camerinus and Spurius Postumius Regilensis were appointed censors. However, the matter, once begun, was interrupted by the death of Postumius. It was deemed religiously improper for a substitute to serve as colleague to a censor. Consequently, after Sulpicius resigned, other censors were appointed, but their appointment was found to be flawed, and they did not discharge the office. A third set was not permitted, as if the gods did not sanction censorship for that year. The tribunes argued that such mockery of the common people could not be tolerated. The Senate, they claimed, was averse to public records, the witnesses of each man's property, because they were unwilling to reveal the true amount of debt. This would clearly show that one part of the state was oppressed by the other, while the common people, burdened with debt, were exposed to one enemy after another. Wars were now indiscriminately sought in every direction. Troops were marched from Antium to Satricum, from Satricum to Velletri, and then to Tusculum. The Latins, Hernicians, and Praenestans were now threatened with hostilities, more through hatred of their fellow citizens than of the enemy, all to wear out the common people under arms, and not allow them to breathe in the city, or reflect on their liberty at leisure, or stand in an assembly where they might hear a tribune's voice discussing the reduction of interest and the termination of other grievances. But if the common people had a spirit mindful of their father's liberty, they urged, they would neither suffer any Roman citizen to be assigned to a creditor on account of debt, nor a levy to be held. Not until the debts were examined and some method adopted for lessening them, would each man know what was his own and what another's, whether his person was still free to him, or if that too was owed to the stocks. The promise of sedition soon brought it forth. Several citizens were indeed assigned to creditors, and due to the rumor of the Praenestan War, the Senate decreed that new legions should be levied. Both measures began to be obstructed by tribunician interposition and the combined efforts of the common people. The tribunes neither allowed those consigned to their creditors to be imprisoned, nor did the young men register for service. The Senate felt less pressing anxiety about enforcing the laws regarding money lending than about the levy, for now it was announced that the enemy, having marched from Praeneste, had encamped in Gabinian territory. This very report, however, only aroused the tribunes of the commons to intensify the struggle, rather than deter them. Nothing else sufficed to allay the discontent in the city, but the approach of hostilities to the very walls. Indeed, when the Praenestans learned that no army was levied in Rome, no general appointed, and that the Senate and people were at odds, their leaders saw an opportunity. Making a hasty march and laying waste to the countryside as they went, they advanced their standards as far as the Colline Gate. Panic gripped the city. The alarm was given to take up arms. People rushed to the walls and gates. At length, turning from internal sedition to external war, they created Titus Quinctius Cincinnatus dictator. He appointed Aulus Sempronius Atratinus as his master of the horse. When this was heard, such was the terror inspired by that office, the enemy retired from the walls, and the young Romans assembled to the edict without refusal. While the army was being levied in Rome, the enemy's camp was pitched not far from the river Allia. From there, laying waste to the land far and wide, they boasted to one another that they had chosen a place fatal to the Roman city. They predicted a similar consternation and flight as had occurred in the Gallic War. For if the Romans dread a day deemed inauspicious and marked with the name of that place, how much more than the Allian day would they dread the Allia itself, the monument of so great a disaster? No doubt, they imagined, the fierce looks of the Gauls and the sound of their voices would recur to their eyes and ears. Pondering these baseless notions and circumstances, they rested their hopes on the fortune of the place. On the other hand, the Romans considered that, wherever a Latin enemy stood, they knew full well they were the same people whom, after utterly defeating at Lake Regillus, they had kept in peaceful subjection for 100 years. The place, marked by the memory of their defeat, would rather stimulate them to blot out the remembrance of their disgrace than raise a fear that any land should be unfavorable to their success. Even if the Gauls themselves were presented to them in that place, they would fight just as they fought at Rome in recovering their country, as the day after at Gabii. Then, they took care that no enemy who had entered the walls of Rome should carry home an account of their success or defeat. With these feelings on either side, they came to the Alia. The Roman dictator, when the enemy were in view, drawn up and ready for action, said, "Aulus Sempronius, do you see that these men have taken their stand at the Alia, relying on the fortune of the place? The immortal gods have granted them nothing of surer confidence or any more effectual support. But you, relying on arms and courage, make a brisk charge in the middle of their line. I will bear down on them when thrown into disorder and consternation with the legions. You gods, witnesses of the treaty, assist us and exact the penalty due for yourselves having been violated, and for us who have been deceived through the appeal made to your divinity." The Praenestans sustained neither the attack of cavalry nor infantry. Their ranks were broken at the first charge and shout. Then, when their line held its ground in no quarter, they turned their backs. Thrown into consternation and carried beyond their own camp by their panic, they did not stop their precipitous speed until Praeneste came into view. There, having been dispersed by their flight, they selected a hasty post for fortification, lest, if they betook themselves within the walls, the countryside should be burned forthwith, and when all places were desolated, siege should be laid to the city. But when the victorious Romans approached, the camp at the Alia having been plundered, that fortress was also abandoned. Considering the walls scarcely secure, they shut themselves within the town of Praeneste. There were 8 other towns under the sway of the Praenestans. Hostilities were extended to these as well, and these being taken one after the other without much difficulty, the army was led to Velletri. This too was taken by storm. They then came to Praeneste, the main source of the war. That town was obtained, not by force, but by capitulation. Titus Quinctius, having been victorious in a pitched battle, having also taken 2 enemy camps and 9 towns by storm, and with Praeneste obtained by surrender, returned to Rome. In his triumph, he brought into the capital the statue of Jupiter Imperator, which he had conveyed from Praeneste. It was dedicated between the recesses of Jupiter and Minerva, and a tablet fixed beneath it, as a monument to his exploits, was engraved with nearly these words: "Jupiter and all the gods granted that Titus Quinctius, dictator, should take 9 towns." On the 20th day after his appointment, he abdicated the dictatorship. An election was held for military tribunes with consular power, resulting in an equal number of patricians and plebeians. Publius and Caius Manlius and Lucius Julius were elected from the patricians. The commons elected Caius Sextilius, Marcus Albinius, and Lucius Antistus. Due to their superior family status, the Manlii were assigned the Volscian province without the usual lottery or mutual agreement. This decision was soon regretted by both the Manlii themselves and the patricians who had granted it. Without any prior reconnaissance, they dispatched cohorts to forage. When a false report reached them that these cohorts were ambushed, they marched in haste to provide support, neglecting to verify the source of the report. This led them directly into an ambush. During the ensuing battle, fought on unfavorable ground, they suffered and inflicted great casualties, relying solely on the soldiers' valor. Meanwhile, the enemy attacked the Roman camp, situated on a plain. The general's recklessness and lack of skill jeopardized both fronts. The Roman people's good fortune and the unwavering courage of the soldiers, even without direct leadership, protected the remaining forces. Upon receiving news of these events in Rome, the initial inclination was to appoint a dictator. However, subsequent intelligence from the Volscian country reported quiet, indicating the enemy's inability to capitalize on their victory. Consequently, the army and generals were recalled, bringing a temporary peace on the Volscian front. The only disturbance towards the year's end was renewed hostilities by the Praenestans, who had incited several Latin states. During this same year, new colonists were enrolled for Caetia, as the colony itself complained of a dwindling population. Domestic tranquility, fostered by the influence of the plebeian military tribunes and the respect shown to them, compensated for the lack of success in war. The following year began with intense civil strife. The military tribunes with consular power were Spurius Furius, Quintus Servilius, for the second time, Caius Licinius, Publius Cloelius, Marcus Horatius, and Lucius Geganius. The primary cause of the unrest was debt. To address this, Spurius Servilius Priscus and Quintus Cloelius Siculus were appointed censors, but their work was interrupted by war. Alarming news, followed by reports of people fleeing their lands, indicated that Volscian legions had crossed the borders and were devastating Roman territory. This external threat, far from quelling internal feuds, intensified the tribunician power's obstruction of the levy. Ultimately, the patricians were compelled to agree that no one would pay tribute during the war, nor would any judicial proceedings be initiated regarding outstanding debts. With this concession, the levy proceeded without delay. New legions were enlisted, and it was decided that 2 armies would march into Volscian territory. Spurius Furius and Marcus Horatius led one army to the right, towards the coast and Antium. Quintus Servilius and Lucius Geganius led the other to the left, towards Aegiatra and the mountains. The enemy did not engage either force. The Romans then laid waste to the land, a devastation far more severe and prolonged than the Volscian incursions. The Volscians had conducted sporadic raids, relying on Roman internal discord and fearing their valor. The Romans, however, had a strategic reason to linger in enemy territory, to provoke an engagement. They burned down all rural houses and some villages, leaving no fruit trees or seeds for future harvests. All movable property, both people and cattle, found outside the city walls was seized. The troops then returned to Rome from both fronts. A brief reprieve was granted to debtors. Once the enemy threat subsided, legal proceedings resumed. Any hope of alleviating old debts vanished, as a new tax was imposed for the construction of a hewn stone wall, commissioned by the censors. The common people were forced to accept this burden, as their tribunes had no levy to obstruct. Under the influence of the nobles, all military tribunes elected were patricians: Lucius Aemilius Publius Valerius for the 4th time, Caius Veturius, Servius Sulpicius, and Lucius and Caius Quinctius Cincinnatus. Through this same influence, 3 armies were raised without opposition, with all younger men taking the military oath. These forces were intended to counter the Latins and Volscians, who were encamped together at Satricum. One army was for city protection, another was held in reserve for sudden emergencies elsewhere. The third, and by far the strongest, was led by Publius Valerius and Lucius Aemilius to Satricum. Upon finding the enemy's battle line drawn up on level ground, they immediately engaged. Before a clear victor emerged, a sudden rainstorm with violent winds halted the battle, despite promising prospects for the Romans. The next day the battle resumed. For a significant period, the Latin troops, well versed in Roman discipline from their long alliance, fought with equal bravery and success. A cavalry charge eventually broke their ranks, and as confusion spread, the Roman infantry advanced. The Roman line pressed forward, dislodging the enemy from their ground. Once the enemy faltered, Roman prowess became unstoppable. The routed enemy fled towards Satricum, 2 miles distant, rather than to their camp. They were primarily cut down by the Roman cavalry. Their camp was subsequently captured and plundered. The night after the battle, they retreated to Antium in a march resembling a panicked flight. Although the Roman army pursued closely, fear propelled the enemy faster than Roman anger. Consequently, the enemy reached the city walls before the Romans could inflict significant harm on their rear. Several days were then spent laying waste to the countryside, as the Romans lacked siege engines to assault the walls, and the Antians were unwilling to risk another pitched battle. At this time, dissension arose between the Antians and the Latins. The Antians, weary and weakened by a prolonged war, began to consider surrender. The Latins, however, invigorated by their recent revolt after a long peace, were determined to continue the fight. The dispute ended when both parties realized they would not impede each other's decisions. The Latins departed, thus avoiding what they considered a dishonorable peace. With the departure of those who had hindered their prudent counsel, the Antians surrendered their city and lands to the Romans. The resentment and rage of the Latins, unable to defeat the Romans in war or keep the Volscians in arms, manifested in setting fire to the city of Satricum, their first refuge after their defeat. No building in the city remained untouched, as they indiscriminately threw firebrands into both sacred and profane structures, save for the temple of Mother Matuta. It is said that neither the sanctity of the building nor reverence for the gods deterred them, but an awful voice from the temple threatened dire vengeance unless they removed their abominable fires from its vicinity. Fueled by this rage, their impetuosity led them to Tusculum, out of resentment for Tusculum's abandonment of the general Latin Confederation and its alliance, as well as its integration into the Roman state. Rushing unexpectedly through the open gates, the town, with the exception of the citadel, was captured with the first shout. The townsmen, with their wives and children, sought refuge in the citadel and sent messengers to Rome to inform the Senate of their plight. An army, commanded by military tribunes Lucius Quinctius and Servius Sulpicius, was dispatched to Tusculum with swiftness befitting Roman honor. They found the gates of Tusculum shut, and the Latins, experiencing both the feelings of besiegers and besieged, simultaneously defending the walls of Tusculum and attacking the citadel. They struck terror and felt it in return. The arrival of the Romans changed the dispositions of both parties. It transformed the Tusculans' great alarm into utmost alacrity, and the Latins' near-certain confidence of taking the citadel, as they controlled the town, into a very slender hope for their own safety. A shout rose from the Tusculans in the citadel, answered by a much louder one from the Roman army. The Latins were pressed from both sides. They could neither withstand the force of the Tusculans pouring down from higher ground, nor repel the Romans advancing to the walls and forcing the gate bars. The walls were first taken by scaling ladders, then the gates were broken open. With enemies pressing from both front and rear, and no strength left to fight or room to flee, they were all cut to pieces to a man. With Tusculum recovered from the enemy, the army returned to Rome. Chapter 5. The Licinian-Sextian Laws and Final Resolution. As tranquility abroad increased due to military successes that year, so too did the violence of the patricians and the distress of the common people within the city. The ability to pay debts was hindered by the very necessity of payment. When they could no longer pay from their property, they were cast in suits and assigned to custody, satisfying their creditors with their reputation and persons, as punishment replaced payment. Consequently, not only the lowest, but even leading men among the commons became so disheartened that no ambitious or adventurous man dared to run for military tribuneship alongside the patricians, a privilege for which they had previously striven, nor even to seek plebeian magistracies. It seemed the patricians had forever regained possession of an honor that had been usurped by the commons for only a few years. A minor incident, as often happens, leading to a significant outcome, intervened to prevent the patricians from exulting too much. Marcus Fabius Ambustus, an influential man among both his peers and the common people, as he was not considered a despiser of their order, had 2 daughters. The elder was married to Servius Sulpicius, the younger to Caius Licinius Stolo, a distinguished but plebeian individual. The fact that such an alliance had not been scorned had gained Fabius influence with the people. It so happened that while the 2 sisters, the Fabii, were conversing in the house of Servius Sulpicius, a military tribune, Sulpicius Lictor, returning from the forum, rapped at the door with his rod, as was customary. The younger Fabia, unfamiliar with this custom, was frightened. Her sister laughed at her surprise. That laugh, however, stung the female mind, sensitive as it is to trifles. Seeing the number of attendants and those seeking her sister's commands, the younger Fabia presumed her sister's match was fortunate and repined at her own, according to that flawed human tendency to be most annoyed when outstripped by those closest. When her father saw her dejected after this recent mortification, he kindly inquired, prevailing upon her, who had been dissembling the cause of her annoyance, as it showed neither affection for her sister nor respect for her husband, to confess that her chagrin stemmed from being united to an inferior and marrying into a house devoid of honor or influence. Ambustus then, consoling his daughter, urged her to keep up her spirits, promising that she would soon see the same honors in her own house as she now saw in her sister's. Upon this, he began to form plans with his son-in-law, having enlisted Lucius Sextius, an ambitious young man whose only lacking attribute was patrician descent. A prime opportunity arose for innovation, driven by an immense debt burden from which the commons saw no relief unless their own party attained the highest authority. They resolved to strive for this objective. The plebeians, through effort and perseverance, had already taken a significant step from which, if they pushed forward, they could reach the summit and stand equal to the patricians in both honor and merit. For the present, it was decided that plebeian tribunes should be created, an office through which they might pave the way for other honors. Caius Licinius and Lucius Sextius, upon being elected tribunes, proposed laws aimed at curbing patrician power and serving the interests of the commons. One law concerned debt. All interest paid would be deducted from the principal, and the remainder paid in 3 equal annual installments. Another dealt with land limitation. No one could possess more than 500 acres. A third proposed abolishing the election of military tribunes and stipulating that at least one consul must be elected from the commons. These were all matters of great importance, achievable only through immense struggle. A contest was thus set forth concerning land, money, and honors, objects of perpetual human desire. The patricians, terrified and dismayed, found no remedy in their public and private consultations except the protest, a tactic employed in many previous disputes. They persuaded their colleagues to oppose the tribunes' bills. When Licinius and Sextius summoned the tribes to vote, their colleagues, surrounded by bands of patricians, prevented the bills from being read and obstructed the usual forms for taking the commons' votes. After several ineffectual assemblies, when the propositions appeared rejected, Sextius declared, "Very well. Since protest holds such power, by that same weapon will we protect the people. Come, patricians, proclaim an assembly for the election of military tribunes. I will ensure that the word 'I forbid it,' which you hear our colleagues chant with such pleasure, will not be so delightful to you." His threats proved effective. No elections were held except for aediles and plebeian tribunes. Licinius and Sextius, re-elected plebeian tribunes, prevented the appointment of any curule magistrates. This complete absence of magistrates persisted in the city for 5 years, with the people re-electing the 2 tribunes, who in turn blocked the election of military tribunes. Other wars ceased at an opportune moment. The colonists of Velletri, emboldened by the absence of a Roman army, repeatedly raided Roman territory and began to besiege Tusculum. This situation, with the Tusculans, old allies and new fellow citizens, imploring aid, stirred not only the patricians but also the commons, primarily out of a sense of honor. The tribunes of the commons relaxed their opposition, and elections were held by the interrex. Lucius Furius, Aulus Manlius, Servius Sulpicius, Servius Cornelius, Publius, and Caius Valerius found the commons far less compliant in the levy than in the elections. An army was eventually raised amidst great contention. They marched forth, not only dislodging the enemy from Tusculum, but also confining them within their own walls. Velletri was then besieged by a much larger force than that which had besieged Tusculum, yet it could not be taken by those who had initiated the siege. New military tribunes were elected: Quintus Servilius, Caius Veturius, Aulus and Marcus Cornelius, Quintus Quinctius, and Marcus Fabius. Even these achieved nothing noteworthy at Velletri. Meanwhile, matters at home grew more perilous. Besides Sextius and Licinius, the proposers of the laws, now re-elected tribunes of the commons for the 8th time, Fabius, the military tribune and father-in-law of Stolo, openly declared himself an unwavering supporter of the laws he had advised. While initially 8 of the college of plebeian tribunes had protested against the laws, now only 5 remained. Dismayed and astonished, as is typical of those who abandon their party, they offered as a reason for their protest the argument taught to them at home. A great number of the commons are absent with the army at Velletri. The assembly should be deferred until the soldiers return, so that the entire body of the commons can vote on their own interests. Sextius and Licinius, with some of their colleagues, and Fabius, one of the military tribunes, now well versed in managing the minds of the commons through years of experience, brought forward leading patricians. They challenged them by questioning them on each of the subjects to be brought before the people. Would they dare to demand that, while 2 acres of land per person were distributed among Thyians, they themselves should be allowed to possess more than 500 acres? That a single man should possess the share of nearly 300 citizens, while a plebeian's portion scarcely provided a meager dwelling and a burial place? Did they wish the commons, overwhelmed by usury, to surrender their persons to the stocks and to punishment, rather than paying off their debt by discharging the principal? That people should be daily led away from the forum in droves, after being assigned to their creditors, and that the houses of the nobility should be filled with prisoners? That wherever a patrician dwelt, there should be a private prison? Having voiced these statements, which were exasperating and pitiable in their recital, before a populace alarmed for themselves, they stirred greater indignation in their hearers than they themselves felt. They affirmed that there would never be an end to the patricians occupying lands or slaughtering the commons with usury, unless the commons elected one consul from among the plebeians as a guardian of their liberty. The tribunes of the commons were now despised, their office weakening its own power through the privilege of protest. There could be no equality of right where dominion lay with one party and only assistance with the other. Unless authority was shared, the commons would never enjoy an equal share in the commonwealth. There was no reason to believe that merely being considered in consular elections was enough for plebeians, unless it was made indispensable that at least one consul be from the commons. No plebeian would ever be elected. Had they forgotten that when it was decided to elect military tribunes instead of consuls, specifically to open the highest honors to plebeians, no one from the commons was elected military tribune for 44 years? How could they suppose that the patricians, who monopolized 8 places in the election of military tribunes, would voluntarily confer a share of honor on the commons when there were only 2 consular positions? That they would allow a path to the consulship to open, when they had so long kept the tribuneship fenced off? They must secure by law what could not be achieved by influence in elections. One consulate must be set aside from contest, accessible to the commons, since when left open to dispute, it would always become the prize of the more powerful. Nor could the old boast be made that there were no qualified plebeians for curule magistracies. Was the government conducted with less activity and vigor since the tribunate of Publius Licinius Calvus, the first plebeian elected to that office, than it was during the years when only patricians were military tribunes? On the contrary, several patricians had been condemned after their tribuneship, but no plebeian. Quaestors, like military tribunes, had begun to be elected from the commons a few years prior, and the Roman people had been satisfied with all of them. The consulate alone remained for the plebeians to attain. It was the bulwark, the prop of their liberty. If they achieved that, then the Roman people would truly believe that kings had been expelled from the city and their liberty firmly established. For from that day, everything in which the patricians surpassed them, power and honor, military glory, birth, nobility, valuable for their own enjoyment now, would be left even more valuable to their children. Seeing these discourses received favorably, they published a new proposition. Instead of 2 commissioners for religious rights, 10 should be appointed, with half elected from the commons and half from the patricians. They deferred the meeting for the discussion of all these propositions until the arrival of the army besieging Velletri. The year concluded before the legions returned from Velletri, thus suspending the question of the laws for the new military tribunes. The commons re-elected the same 2 plebeian tribunes, as they were the proposers of the laws. Titus Quinctius, Servius Cornelius, Servius Sulpicius, Spurius Servilius, Lucius Papirius, and Lucius Valerius were elected military tribunes. Immediately at the beginning of the year, the question of the laws was pushed to the extreme of contention. When the tribes were called, and the protest of their colleagues failed to deter the proposers of the laws, the alarmed patricians resorted to their last 2 aids, the highest authority and the most esteemed citizen. It was resolved that a dictator be appointed, Marcus Furius Camillus was appointed, who nominated Lucius Aemilius as his master of the horse. To counter such a powerful measure from their opponents, the proposers of the laws also pressed the people's cause with great determination. Having convened an assembly of the people, they summoned the tribes to vote. The dictator took his seat, accompanied by a band of patricians full of anger and threats. The business began with the usual contention of the plebeian tribunes, some proposing the law and others protesting. Although the protest was rightfully more powerful, it was still overwhelmed by the popularity of the laws themselves and their proposers. When the first tribes declared, "Be it as you propose," Camillus spoke. "Since, Romans, tribunician extravagance, not authority, sways you now, and you are rendering the right of protest, formerly acquired by a secession of the commons, totally unavailing by the same violent conduct by which you acquired it, I, as dictator, will support the right of protest, not more for the interest of the whole commonwealth than for your sake, and by my authority I will defend your rights of protection which have been overturned. Therefore, if Caius Licinius and Lucius Sextius give way to the protest of their colleagues, I shall not introduce a patrician magistrate into an assembly of the commons. If, in opposition to the right of protest, they strive to saddle laws on the state as though captive, I will not suffer the tribunician power to be destroyed by itself." When the plebeian tribunes persisted in the matter with unabated energy and contempt, Camillus, highly provoked, sent his lictors to disperse the commons. He added threats that if they persisted, he would bind the younger men by military oath and immediately lead an army out of the city. This struck great terror into the people. The opposition inflamed rather than lessened the spirits of their leaders. But with neither side gaining ground, he abdicated his dictatorship. This was either because he had been appointed with some informality, as some have stated, or because the tribunes of the people proposed to the commons, and the commons passed it, that if Marcus Furius did anything as dictator, he would be fined 500,000 asses. However, both the character of the man himself and the fact that Publius Manlius was immediately substituted as dictator incline me to believe that he was deterred by some defect in the auspices rather than by this unprecedented order. What would be the use of appointing Manlius to manage a contest in which Camillus had been defeated? And because the following year saw the same Marcus Furius as dictator, he certainly would not without shame have resumed an authority that had been defeated in his hands just the year before. At the same time, at the moment the motion about finding him is said to have been published, he could either resist this order, which he saw as degrading him, or he could not have obstructed those other motions for which this was introduced. Throughout the entire series of disputes regarding tribunician and consular authority, even down to our own memory, the preeminence of the dictatorship was always decisive. Between the abdication of the former dictatorship and Manlius' assumption of the new one, an assembly of the commons was held by the tribunes, almost as if it were an interregnum. It became clear which of the proposed laws were more appealing to the commons, and which to the proposers themselves. The bills regarding interest and land were passed, but the one concerning a plebeian consulship was rejected. Both decisions would have been enacted, had the tribunes not declared that they consulted the people on all the laws collectively. Publius Manlius, the dictator, then swayed the advantage toward the people by naming Caius Licinius, a plebeian who had been a military tribune, as master of the horse. The patricians, I understand, were much displeased by this nomination, but the dictator excused himself to the Senate, citing his close relationship with Licinius and denying that the master of the horse's authority exceeded that of a consular tribune. When the elections for plebeian tribunes were announced, Licinius and Sextius skillfully feigned disinterest in continuing their office, thereby powerfully motivating the commons to achieve what they secretly desired. They argued that they had stood as if in battle against the patricians for 9 years, risking their private interests without any public benefit. They claimed that the measures they had published and the full strength of the tribunician authority had grown old with them. Their propositions had been attacked first by their colleagues' protest, then by sending their youth to war in Velatry, and finally by the dictatorial thunder leveled against them. Now they asserted neither colleagues, nor war, nor dictator stood in their way. For the current dictator, by nominating a plebeian as master of the horse, had even offered an omen for a plebeian consul. They contended that the commons were impeding their own progress and interests. If they wished, they could free the city and forum from creditors, and their lands from unjust possessors. When they asked, would the commons ever show sufficient gratitude for these kindnesses if, while receiving measures concerning their own interests, they cut off all hope of distinction for those who authored them? It was not becoming the modesty of the Roman people to demand relief from usury and possession of unjustly occupied land by the wealthy, while leaving those who secured these advantages, now old tribunes, not only without honor but even without the hope of it. Therefore they should first decide what choice they would make, then declare that choice at the tribunician elections. If they wished for all their published measures to pass collectively, there was reason to re-elect the same tribunes, for they would carry into effect what they proposed. But if they only wanted what was individually necessary, there was no need for the unpopular continuation of their honor. They would neither have the tribuneship, nor would the people gain the proposed matters. In response to such peremptory language from the tribunes, amazement at their insolence and silence rendered all other patricians motionless. Appius Claudius Crassus, grandson of the Decemvir, is said to have stepped forward to refute their arguments, driven more by hatred and anger than by hope of success. He spoke nearly to this effect: Romans, it would be neither new nor surprising for me to hear today the charge that has always been leveled against our family by turbulent tribunes, that from the beginning nothing in the state has been more important to the Claudian family than the dignity of the patricians, that they have always resisted the interests of the commons. Of these charges, I neither deny nor object to the one that, since our admission into the state and among the patricians, we have strenuously done our utmost to ensure that the dignity of those families, among whom you were pleased to place us, has truly increased rather than diminished. With respect to the other charge, in my own defense and that of my ancestors, I would venture to maintain, Romans, unless one considers actions for the general good of the state as injurious to the commons, as if they were inhabitants of another city, that we, neither privately nor officially, ever knowingly did anything intended to be detrimental to the commons. No act or word of ours can truly be mentioned as contrary to your interest, though some may have been contrary to your inclinations. Even if I were not of the Claudian family, nor descended from patrician blood, but an ordinary Roman citizen, feeling myself descended from free-born parents and living in a free state, could I be silent on this matter? Lucius Sextius and Gaius Licinius, perpetual tribunes, have accumulated such arrogance during their 9 years in power. They refuse to allow you the free exercise of your suffrage, either at elections or in enacting laws. One of them states, on a certain condition, you shall re-elect us tribunes for the 10th time. What else is this but saying, what others sue for we disdain so thoroughly that, without some consideration, we will not accept it? I beg you, tribunes of the commons, suppose that I, an individual citizen, should call out in reply from the middle of the assembly, with your good leave, let it be permitted us to select out of these measures those which we deem beneficial to us, to reject the others. It will not be permitted, he says. Must you enact concerning the interest of money and the lands, that which tends to the interest of you all? And must this monstrosity not take place in the city of Rome, the site of Lucius Sextius and Gaius Licinius as consuls, a thing you loathe and abominate? Either admit all, or I propose none. It is as if someone were to place poison and food together before a starving person, and order him either to abstain from that which would sustain life, or to mix with it that which would cause death. Therefore, if this state were free, would they not all in full assembly have replied to you, begone hence with your tribuneships and your propositions? What? If you will not propose that which it is in the people's interest to accept, will there be no one who will propose it? If any patrician, or what they desire to be still more invidious, any Claudius should say, either accept all, or I propose nothing, which of you Romans would bear it? Will you never look at facts rather than persons? Will you always listen with partial ears to everything that officer says, and with prejudiced ears to what may be said by any of us? But by Jove, their language is by no means becoming members of a republic. What sort of measure is it which they are indignant at having been rejected by you? It is very like their language, Romans. I ask, he says, that it may not be lawful for you to elect as consuls such persons as you may wish. Does he require anything else, who orders that one consul at least be elected from the commons, and does not grant you the power of electing 2 patricians? If there were wars today, such as the Etruscan, when Porsenna took the Janiculum, or the Gallic war recently, when, except the capital and citadel, all these places were in possession of the enemy, and should Lucius Sextius stand candidate for the consulate with Marcus Furius or any other of the patricians, could you endure that Sextius should be consul without any risk, while Camillus should run the risk of a repulse? Is this allowing a community of honors, that it should be lawful for 2 plebeians, and not lawful for 2 patricians, to be made consuls? And that it should be necessary that one be elected from among the commons, and lawful to pass by both of the patricians? What fellowship, what confederacy is that? Is it not sufficient if you come in for a share of that in which you had no share hitherto, unless, while suing for a part, you seize on the whole? I fear, he says, lest, if it be lawful for 2 patricians to be elected, you will elect no plebeian. What else is this but saying, because you will not of your own choice elect unworthy persons, I will impose on you the necessity of electing persons whom you do not wish? What follows, but that if one plebeian stands candidate with 2 patricians, he owes no obligation to the people, and may say that he was appointed by the law, not by suffrages. How they may extort, not how they may sue for honors, is what they seek. They are anxious to attain the highest honor, so that they may not owe the obligations incurred even for the lowest. They prefer to sue for honors through favorable conjunctions rather than by merit. Is there anyone who can feel it an affront to have himself inspected and estimated, who thinks it reasonable that to himself alone, amid struggling competitors, honors should be certain? Who would withdraw himself from your judgment? Who would make your suffrages necessary instead of voluntary, servile instead of free? I omit mention of Licinius and Sextius, whose years of perpetuated power you number as that of the kings in the capital. Who is there today in the state so lowly to whom the road to the consulate is not rendered easier through the advantages of that law than to us and to our children? Inasmuch as you will sometimes not be able to elect us, even though you may wish it, those persons you must elect, even though you were unwilling. Of the insult offered to merit, enough has been said, for merit appears to human beings. What shall I say respecting religion and the auspices, which is contempt and injustice relating exclusively to the immortal gods? Who does not know that this city was built by auspices, that all things are conducted by auspices during war and peace, at home and abroad? In whom, therefore, are the auspices vested according to the usage of our forefathers? In the patricians, no doubt, for no plebeian magistrate is ever elected by auspices. So peculiar to us are the auspices that not only do the people elect in no other manner, save by auspices, the patrician magistrates whom they do elect, but even we ourselves, without the suffrages of the people, appoint the interrex by auspices, and in our private station we hold those auspices, which they do not hold even in office. What else, then, does he do than abolish auspices out of the state, who, by creating plebeian consuls, takes them away from the patricians who alone can hold them? They may now mock religion. For what else is it if the chickens do not feed? If they come out too slowly from the coop? If a bird chants an unfavorable note? These are trifling, but by not despising these trifling matters, our ancestors have raised this state to the highest eminence. Now, as if we had no need for the favor of the gods, we violate all religious ceremonies. Wherefore let pontiffs, augurs, kings of the sacrifices be appointed at random. Let us place the tiara of Jupiter's flamen on any person, provided he is a man. Let us hand over the ancilia, the shrines, the gods, and the charge of the worship of the gods, to those to whom it is impious to commit them. Let not laws be enacted, nor magistrates elected under auspices. Let not the Senate give their approbation, either to the assemblies of the centuries or of the curiae. Let Sextius and Licinius, like Romulus and Tatius, reign in the city of Rome, because they give away as donations other persons' money and lands. So great is the charm of plundering the possessions of other persons. Nor does it occur to you that by the one law vast wilds are produced throughout the lands by expelling the proprietors from their territories. By the other, credit is destroyed, along with which all human society ceases to exist. For every reason, I consider that those propositions ought to be rejected by you. Whatever you may do, I pray to the gods to render it successful. Appius' speech merely deferred the moment for passing the propositions. The same tribunes, Sextius and Licinius, re-elected for the 10th time, then succeeded in passing a law stipulating that half of the decemvirs for religious matters should be elected from the commons. 5 patricians and 5 plebeians were chosen, a step that seemed to open the way to the consulship. Content with this victory, the commons allowed the patricians to elect military tribunes, temporarily omitting any mention of consuls. Aulus and Marcus Cornelius for the 2nd time, Marcus Geganius, Publius Manlius, Lucius Veturius, and Publius Valerius for the 6th time were elected. With no foreign concerns troubling the Romans, save for the slow but certain siege of Velletri, a sudden rumor of a Gallic war prompted the state to appoint Marcus Furius dictator for the 5th time. He named Titus Quinctius Pennus master of the horse. Claudius asserts that a battle was fought that year with the Gauls on the banks of the Anio, and that the famous battle on the bridge occurred there, where Titus Manlius, challenged by a Gaul, slew him in the sight of both armies and stripped him of his chain. However, I am persuaded by the authority of several writers that these events happened at least 10 years later. Instead, in this year, a pitched battle was fought with the Gauls by the dictator, Marcus Furius, in the territory of Alba. The Roman victory was neither doubtful nor difficult, despite the great terror the Gauls had instilled due to a previous defeat. Many thousands of the barbarians were slain on the field, and great numbers perished in the storming of their camp. The rest dispersed, mostly fleeing towards Apulia, saving themselves from the enemy by maintaining their flight over a great distance, and because panic and terror had scattered them widely. A triumph was decreed to the dictator with the concurrence of the Senate and Commons. He had scarcely finished the war when a more violent disturbance awaited him at home. Through great struggles, the dictator and the Senate were overcome, and the tribunes' measures were admitted. Consular elections were held despite patrician resistance, at which Lucius Sextius was made consul, the first of plebeian rank. Even this did not end the contests. Because the patricians refused to give their approbation, the affair came very near a secession of the people and other terrible threats of civil strife. However, the dissensions were eventually resolved on certain terms through the dictator's interference. Concessions were made by the nobility to the commons regarding the plebeian consul, and by the commons to the nobility regarding one praetor to be elected from the patricians to administer justice in the city. The different orders, at length restored to concord after their long-standing animosity, prompted the Senate to consider performing the most magnificent games, believing it a deserved act for the immortal gods, if ever there was one. They also proposed adding 1 day to the customary 3. When the plebeian aediles refused the office, the young patricians cried out with one accord that they would readily undertake the task out of honor for the immortal gods, provided they were appointed aediles. All expressed their gratitude, and a decree of the Senate passed that the dictator should ask the people for 2 aediles from among the patricians, and that the Senate should approve all elections for that year.